They saw the uniform before they saw the man. A faded jumpsuit, worn-out shoes, and a mop handle still fresh with sweat from a morning shift. The courtroom, clad in polished wood and whispered judgments, barely glanced up as he stepped forward. To most, he was just the janitor, a background character in the grand play of law and order. No one paused to consider why he had been called, or what truth he might carry. Instead, they smirked. The gallery shifted in their seats. The attorneys exchanged quick, knowing looks. The judge, a seasoned man with a reputation for sharp rulings and sharper remarks, chuckled under his breath. It wasn't just a laugh, it was dismissal. Dismissal wrapped in decades of assumptions, tied in ribbons of prejudice, and wrapped in the belief that someone who scrubs floors couldn't possibly speak in a place built for suits and legal jargon. The janitor wasn't just out of place. He was invisible until he disrupted their assumptions. But in that moment, standing alone under the high lights of the court, he stood as something more than a man with a mop. He was a reflection of how we judge without listening, assume without asking, and label without knowing. From the moment he entered, the courtroom decided what kind of man he was. That he was uneducated, that he wouldn't know the law, that his words would be broken or incoherent, maybe even irrelevant. They saw his rough hands and sun-aged face as signs of inferiority. He was not the person they expected to be credible or articulate, and certainly not someone who could challenge the sanctity of the court. To them, he was the help, nothing more, and definitely nothing that required attention or respect. In a system built on order, appearances often create invisible hierarchies. Robes mean respect, badges mean authority, titles mean credibility. And when someone shows up without any of those, they are often met with doubt. He carried none of the visible signs that the court equated with intelligence or power. No law degree, no briefcase, no tailored suit. He didn't walk like someone used to speaking in courtrooms, and that, to them, said everything they thought they needed to know. Yet, what they didn't see was the truth he carried. The hours he had spent reading in silence during graveyard shifts. The pages of history he had memorized between cleaning hallways. The way he had once served in a war, came home, and was denied opportunities his fellow soldiers received freely. They didn't know the schools that turned him away. The debates he watched silently from the back of lecture halls he was never allowed to enter. The letters he had written, the complaints he had filed, the injustices he had witnessed, scrubbed away day after day like the dirt from courthouse floors. And when he stepped up to testify, none of that mattered to them. Not yet. All they saw was the surface, the image they had already filed away before he said a single word. They didn't expect depth, so they didn't prepare for it. The judge, especially, wore his superiority like a second robe, visible in every amused glance, every slow lean into his chair, every blink that said, "This won't take long." He had seen this story before, or so he thought, but the real story wasn't in the man's clothes. It wasn't in the way he entered, or how he stood. It was in everything that had been ignored. Years of living under the radar, of watching, learning, and remembering. It was in the quiet resolve he carried, the kind that comes not from arrogance, but from experience. He didn't need to speak loudly. He didn't need theatrics. All he needed was the truth, and the voice to deliver it in a place that had already decided he was unworthy of being heard. Still, in that very decision to judge him by appearance alone, the court revealed its own weakness. For what is justice if it cannot recognize truth from a man without status? What is authority if it can't see past fabric and footwear? And what is intelligence if it's measured only by where you sit and not what you know? The room was filled with polished professionals, attorneys with sharp suits, clerks tapping away on their laptops, and a judge presiding with the air of someone used to being the smartest in the room. No one expected much from the janitor who stepped up to speak. In fact, most barely acknowledged his presence at all. A few eyes flicked in his direction, then just as quickly dismissed him. But beneath the surface of that quiet man, behind the calloused hands and work-worn clothes, lay a depth of knowledge none of them had anticipated. What they didn't know, what they hadn't even considered possible, was that this janitor had spent years absorbing the law, not from a classroom, but from lived experience, from books borrowed on long night shifts, and from listening closely to every word in courtrooms he was hired to clean. He had never set foot in a law school, but he had studied the Constitution like scripture. He hadn't passed the bar, but he had memorized its foundation. Every clause, every amendment, every phrase. It wasn't just information to him. It was survival. It was identity. It was the only armor he could afford in a system that often ignored men like him. While others relied on privilege and connections, he relied on discipline. And when the moment came to speak, he did not stammer. He did not fumble. He did not shrink. Instead, he opened his mouth and delivered a precise, articulate, and unwavering recitation of constitutional principles that silenced the room. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of conviction. It was the kind of voice that didn't demand attention. It earned it. With every word, he dismantled the assumption that intellect belongs only to those with degrees. With every quote, he reminded the room that knowledge is not bound by occupation. The attorneys, who moments before had been checking their watches and smirking into their coffee cups, began to lean forward. One even stopped typing mid-note. The judge, who had begun the testimony with an amused glance, slowly straightened in his chair. Something had shifted. The janitor was no longer invisible. He was undeniable. He quoted not just the Constitution, but case law. He referenced legal precedent with startling accuracy. He outlined rights, responsibilities, and protections in a language even the professionals in the room would struggle to deliver without preparation. There were no notes in his hand, no documents to guide him, only memory, sharpened by necessity, and a mind trained through determination rather than instruction. He was not there to impress. He was there to be heard. And the words he spoke rang with a clarity that cut through the usual pomp and performance of courtroom ritual. People often equate uniforms with limitations. A janitor's jumpsuit signals labor, not logic. But this man defied that perception with every sentence. He had worked in silence for years, but he had been listening all along. He understood not just the words of the Constitution, but the spirit behind them. He had seen where those rights were upheld, and more often, where they were denied. He had seen decisions rendered not on facts, but on faces. And in his mind, justice wasn't something handed down from the bench. It was something that had to be demanded, articulated, and defended. The most remarkable part was not just what he knew, but how confidently he carried it. There was no arrogance in his tone, only certainty. He wasn't trying to prove he was smarter than anyone else. He was simply refusing to let them forget that truth and intelligence don't always wear robes and ties. Sometimes they wear name tags. Sometimes they mop the floors while others debate ethics above them. Sometimes they sweep up the dust of cases that never made it to trial, the ones that slipped through the cracks of justice too small to be noticed by anyone who never had to bend down and clean them. He didn't interrupt. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He presented, cleanly, clearly, and with the kind of reverence for the law that many professionals in the room had long since lost. And as he spoke, even those who had dismissed him began to recognize what was happening. They weren't witnessing an exception. They were witnessing the failure of a system to recognize potential in plain sight. This wasn't a lucky moment. This was a man who had been prepared all along, waiting for the chance to show that knowledge can come from anywhere. The Constitution wasn't written in marble. It was written in ink by imperfect men, meant to guide an imperfect nation. And somewhere along the way, many forgot who it was written for. In that courtroom, where the air was thick with judgment and protocol, it took a janitor to remind them, not with opinions or emotional appeals, but with the very words that built the foundation of the country. As he began to speak, what once seemed impossible unfolded in real time. The janitor, overlooked by nearly everyone in the room, began quoting the United States Constitution verbatim, not paraphrased, not interpreted, word for word. Each line rolled off his tongue with the kind of precision that came only from deep understanding and relentless repetition. He wasn't performing. He wasn't showboating. He was stating facts, legal facts, foundational truths. And he was doing it better than most law students, better than many lawyers, better than the very people who were sworn to uphold it. His recitation wasn't dry or robotic. It was alive with purpose. You could hear the weight of history in his voice. You could sense the moments he had spent reading those words under dim lights during night shifts, committing them to memory not for applause, but for protection. Because for people like him, the Constitution wasn't just a document. It was a shield, a promise, a hope that maybe, in some corner of the system, justice could still be real. He knew the amendments like he knew the corridors he cleaned. He could trace the evolution of case law the same way others traced blueprints or contracts. And every word he recited was a challenge to the assumptions in that room. He didn't just know the law, he believed in it, even when it hadn't always believed in him. It was power without posture, authority without arrogance, the kind of knowledge that had nothing to prove but everything to reveal. When he quoted the First Amendment, the court went still. When he moved on to the Fourth and Fifth, even the clerks looked up from their screens. By the time he spoke on due process and equal protection, the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer a courtroom watching a janitor. It was a courtroom being schooled by a citizen who had internalized the law with more discipline than many professionals inside those walls. He didn't miss a word. He didn't stumble. His cadence was steady, his tone measured. It wasn't just about knowing the Constitution, it was about owning it. Every article he recited was laced with personal meaning. You could hear it, if you listened closely enough. These weren't abstract principles to him. They were the result of a lifetime of learning what justice looks like when you live on the margins. They were the answer to every door that had been shut in his face, every assumption made about his intellect, every policy that had passed him over. The irony was striking. In a place where truth was supposed to reign, it had taken a janitor to deliver it. Not with emotion, but with unshakable knowledge. Not with status, but with substance. The judge, who moments earlier had chuckled at the thought of this man offering anything valuable to the case, now sat silently, hands folded, eyes fixed. The attorneys, who had dismissed him as irrelevant, now found themselves trying to recall the same amendments he quoted effortlessly. There was a kind of poetry in it, though he wasn't trying to be poetic. He was just telling the truth. And the truth was this: the Constitution was never meant to be exclusive. It was never meant to be locked behind law degrees or reserved for courtrooms. It was meant for every citizen. And he was proving that, not by arguing about it, but by embodying it. The room that once laughed was now listening. The people who once dismissed him were now reconsidering everything they thought they knew. And the man in the jumpsuit, the one who had walked in with no legal standing, now stood on the highest ground possible, the ground of unfiltered, irrefutable truth. The laughter didn't last long. What began as smirks and whispered jokes quickly gave way to something else: silence. Not the polite kind, not the procedural stillness that courtrooms are known for, but the kind of silence that falls when something unexpected happens, something undeniable. It wasn't planned. No one rehearsed for it. But as the janitor spoke, line after line of constitutional text spilling from his memory, the room stopped breathing for a moment. You could feel it in the way chairs stopped shifting. You could sense it in the halted scribbles of courtroom stenographers. Even the judge, who had chuckled earlier at the absurdity of this man offering legal testimony, had gone completely still. That kind of silence speaks louder than any outburst. It's not just a reaction, it's a recalibration, a shift in perception. It's the sound of minds being forced to reconsider what they thought they knew. A janitor quoting the Constitution verbatim wasn't part of their script. They had prepared for witnesses, for legal arguments, for rebuttals. They hadn't prepared for him. And now, all the assumptions that had filled the room just moments earlier were being quietly dismantled by the weight of his words. He stood there, not with a raised voice or dramatic tone, but with steady, deliberate calm. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He wasn't seeking applause. He didn't change his tone to match the gravity of the moment, because the gravity was already there, in his presence, in his knowledge, in his absolute control of the moment. Without raising a hand, he raised the stakes. Without raising his voice, he raised the standard. And that silence, the one that overtook the room, was the first real sign that everyone knew it. It started in the eyes. First, the judges, then the attorneys. You could see the way they shifted, how their expressions slowly changed from smug amusement to guarded attentiveness. They were still and focused, no longer waiting to object or interrupt, but trying to absorb, trying to catch up. They were witnessing something they couldn't quite categorize. This wasn't just an unexpected witness. This was a disruption to the unspoken hierarchy of the courtroom. And disruptions, when rooted in truth, have a way of humbling even the most confident. There's a kind of power in watching someone reveal themselves as far more than what they were perceived to be. In that moment, the janitor held that power, not in the form of domination, but in the form of presence. The room wasn't silent because of fear or intimidation. It was silent because the truth, when presented with such clarity and confidence, demands attention. No robe, no gavel, no years of legal training could prepare them for that kind of unshakable truth. It was raw, it was authentic, and it was grounded in something deeper than law. It was grounded in experience. He wasn't reciting legal text for effect. He was speaking from a place of personal history. Every word he spoke had lived inside him longer than anyone in that courtroom could imagine. He had studied while others slept. He had learned in spaces where knowledge wasn't handed out freely. And now, standing before those who once dismissed him, he was not just equal, he was leading. And no one interrupted him, because no one could. Not because of protocol, but because they didn't dare disrupt the moment. The silence was both a surrender and an acknowledgement. A collective recognition that the man standing before them was not the man they assumed he was. There's something deeply humbling about being proven wrong by someone you didn't think was capable of teaching you. That humility spread slowly across the room, visible in the posture of the audience. Backs once leaned in arrogance began to straighten. Pens once poised for dismissive notes now hovered, waiting to capture something valuable. Faces that once smirked now stared with quiet awe. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The silence said everything. It was respect. It was realization. It was the sound of preconceptions crumbling without anyone saying a word. Even when he paused, the silence remained. There were no coughs, no shuffles, no side comments. Just stillness. Stillness filled with reflection. Stillness that made everyone painfully aware of their earlier laughter. Because now, that laughter felt hollow. Now, it echoed in their own minds as a reminder of their mistake. The silence replaced mockery because knowledge had replaced assumption. Dignity had replaced dismissal. Truth had replaced performance. And none of it came from a place of anger. It came from a place of undeniable fact, delivered by someone who had nothing to prove and everything to say. He didn't come into the courtroom to argue. He didn't raise his voice or point fingers. He didn't try to shame anyone into listening. Instead, he did something far more disruptive. He used knowledge. Not rehearsed lines or second-hand interpretations, but his own understanding, honed through long nights of reading, listening, and learning. When he began to speak, it wasn't the tone that changed the atmosphere. It was the content. His words weren't fueled by outrage or vengeance. They were powered by clarity, and that made them far more powerful than any outburst ever could be. Most people expect authority to come from position, from title, from status. They're trained to look at uniforms and badges and robes as signals of who gets to speak and who gets heard. But he had none of that. Just an old uniform that said maintenance stitched into the chest, and years of living under a system that often mistook silence for ignorance. What they didn't realize was that silence can be a tool. In his case, it was preparation. It was observation. It was study. And when the time came to speak, his words weren't loud, but they were exact. He spoke of rights. Not vague ideas, but specific, constitutional protections. The kind that law students spend semesters trying to memorize. The kind that lawyers get wrong under pressure. He quoted them not from a book or a screen, but from memory, from experience. He laid them out like pieces of evidence, one by one, without stammering or second-guessing. He wasn't asking for recognition. He wasn't demanding anything. He was just stating what was written, clearly, confidently, and without apology. There was no bitterness in his tone. He didn't need it. He had something stronger, truth. And that truth didn't need to shout. It didn't need theatrics. It didn't even need validation from the people in the room. His calmness wasn't passive, it was powerful. It came from knowing exactly what he was talking about, from being certain of the law even when others weren't. It was the kind of calm that comes from surviving misunderstanding after misunderstanding and still having the patience to speak with precision instead of rage. You could see the shift in how the courtroom responded to him. They didn't just stop laughing, they started listening. Not because he forced them to, but because they couldn't deny what was happening. Authority in that room had been unspokenly defined by degrees and experience and reputation. But suddenly, authority was being redefined by knowledge. Real knowledge. Earned knowledge. The kind that doesn't get handed out, but built slowly, day by day, in silence and in shadow. His testimony wasn't emotional, but it was deeply moving. Not because he cried or raised his fists, but because he didn't need to. Every sentence was a statement of fact, and every fact chipped away at the assumptions people had made about him before he opened his mouth. It's easy to dismiss anger. It's harder to dismiss a man calmly, methodically, and without error, dismantling every legal argument you thought he wasn't qualified to challenge. He didn't attack anyone personally. He didn't speak in bitterness or contempt. His weapon was knowledge, and he used it precisely. There's a unique kind of strength in being able to stand in front of people who underestimated you and correct them, not by fighting, but by teaching. Not by humiliating them, but by holding up a mirror and letting them see their own bias reflected back. That's what he did, word by word, clause by clause. He used the very document they were sworn to uphold to remind them of its meaning, not from a place of rebellion, but from a place of reverence. In a world that often rewards aggression with attention, his calm demeanor stood out even more. It forced the room to adjust to him instead of the other way around. His control of the moment didn't come from volume. It came from value. What he had to say mattered more than how he said it. He didn't try to dominate the courtroom. He simply belonged in it, and that alone changed the dynamics. No one had expected that the janitor would be the one to guide the conversation back to the roots of the law. No one had guessed that the calmest voice would become the strongest. Respect isn't something that can be demanded and truly held. It's something that must be earned, often in the quietest and most unexpected ways. When the janitor first stepped into that courtroom, there was little expectation that he would command any form of respect at all. In fact, everything about him, from his uniform to his posture, was quietly dismissed by those around him. He didn't carry himself with the swagger of a seasoned attorney, nor did he radiate the polished confidence of someone used to public speaking. But there was something steady about him, something grounded. And when he began to speak, it became clear that his power didn't come from his status. It came from the truth he carried. The courtroom, a space designed to weigh facts and uphold justice, was suddenly reoriented not by a judge's gavel, but by the clarity of a man who had never been invited to speak in such a space before. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. His words weren't fancy, but they were precise. He didn't have to dress the part to prove he belonged there. He proved it with knowledge. With every sentence that left his mouth, the atmosphere in the room changed. It shifted from disbelief to discomfort, then from discomfort to realization. Because in that moment, the people in the courtroom weren't just listening to a janitor speak. They were watching every assumption they held unravel in real time. They were witnessing someone they had placed beneath them reveal that he understood the law better than they did. And that shift in awareness, that quiet recognition, is where respect begins. Not out of pity, not out of shock, but out of truth made visible. He didn't ask to be respected. He gave them no choice. He didn't point fingers at anyone. He didn't drag up the insult of being laughed at when he first walked in. He simply kept his focus on the principles that mattered. He quoted the Constitution without missing a word. He cited legal precedents without looking at a note. He reminded them, indirectly but undeniably, that titles and robes do not make someone more just or more informed. What makes a person worth listening to is the content of what they say and how they choose to say it, especially when given the chance to retaliate and choosing not to. As he continued, respect began to fill the spaces that judgment had once occupied. You could see it in the way people sat forward, no longer leaning back with their arms crossed. You could hear it in the absence of whispers. There was no side talk, no shifting papers, no half-hearted attention. Every eye was on him, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it through sheer preparation and quiet resolve. What made his words even more powerful was the fact that they weren't delivered with superiority. He wasn't trying to make anyone feel small. He wasn't interested in revenge or humiliation. He was interested in making the truth clear, in making sure that everyone in that room, regardless of how they had viewed him minutes earlier, walked away knowing that a janitor had held the law in his mind and heart with more reverence than most of them had in their careers. Respect is often confused with fear or status, but the deepest kind of respect comes when someone shows integrity in a situation where no one expects it. It comes when a person is offered the perfect opportunity to lash out, and instead, chooses discipline. It comes when someone who has been underestimated chooses to uplift the very principles that others have forgotten. That's what he did. He elevated the moment by refusing to stoop to the level of those who mocked him. His uniform didn't change. His job title didn't change. But the way he was seen had changed completely. He had walked into the courtroom as someone barely noticed. Now, even those who hadn't spoken a word to him were glancing at him with quiet regard. They weren't reacting to what he wore, but to what he knew, and more importantly, how he carried that knowledge. Calmly, honorably, unshaken. That is the essence of true respect, not given because of fear, not offered because of wealth, but earned in the presence of truth, delivered with unwavering dignity.